Uh-oh. He took notes for this sermon. That usually means long. I don't think it should be too long. I'll try not to make it too long. But there are quite a number of ways to look at this gospel. First of all, there's the idea of binding and loosing. The Reverend Know-It-All comments on binding and loosing that it was a phrase among rabbis to bind and to loose. That it didn't mean you could change the law, but you applied and interpreted it. There were stricter and less strict interpretations of law, and that was something that rabbis did. In effect, when Jesus said to Peter, "To you I give the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven," in a sense, he made Peter the rabbi to the whole world. He made a rabbi for the whole world, someone who could interpret what God meant. And it doesn't change it, but applies it. Also, that idea of the keys of the kingdom, and we have the first reading about the transfer of the keys of the house of David. In the royal kingdom of David, there was clearly what they called an albayit. Not I will buy it, but an albayit, someone who's over the house. And it would be a grand vizier or a prime minister. The kingdom of David had a prime minister. It was a continuing and hereditary position. And Jesus appointed a prime minister for his household, the church. And it's also a continuing office, has turned out to be a very consistently continuing office. And all those things come into this passage. However, a few months ago or weeks ago, there was a picture of me in the bulletin standing in the gates of hell. Do you remember that? Our pastor standing in the gates of hell. Well, last February I had the privilege to go to the Holy Land, and I had never seen this before. They took us way up north into what is actually Lebanon, but is now occupied by Israeli soldiers. And it was kind of a little nerve-wracking because on either side of the road there were signs, "Caution, minefield." So, they took us up to this place called Banyas, which is the source of the River Jordan. And the Jordan springs out of a rock. It is a huge rock. It is about the size of this church, but about 5 times as long. It's huge. And in that rock there is a cave, and that's the cave from which this spring originally flowed. And the ancients didn't have a very clear picture of life after death, but they talked about the underworld where people's souls had sort of a shadow existence. They called it Hades, or in a translation into earlier English, hell. Doesn't mean what we mean by hell, a place with little fellows in red union suits with pitchforks. That's not what was meant. It was a place simply like limbo. It was a kind of limbo, a place of shadowy existence. And the ancients believed this cave had no bottom, and that it went down into this underworld, this netherworld. And it was a very sacred place for them. Now, the family of King Herod were devout Jews when they were in Israel. When they weren't in Israel, they weren't so devout. So this was across the border in what is today Lebanon. And so Herod, the grandson of Herod, had built, Herod Philippus had built a beautiful temple right in the mouth of this cave, dedicated to the divine Caesar. The ancient Romans believed that their rulers were touched with a spark of divinity. They thought they were divine, and then they'd assassinate one and appoint another divine emperor. So Philippus, wanting to make sure that he was on the right political side of the occupying power, built a beautiful temple to the divine Caesar. And it was right in the mouth of this cave from which the River Jordan sprang. And it was impressive. This beautiful city of gleaming temples that just evoked the power of the family of Herod and evoked the power of the Roman emperors. And Peter and Jesus and the others, in the eyes of these great powers, were as inconsequential as fleas Any one of these people, Herod or Augustus, could just squash them like a bug with impunity. They were nobody. We celebrated the feast of the Assumption of our Blessed Mother, and the text talked about, it quoted the Magnificat, and in that text is the line, "He has looked on the lowliness of his servant." That word in Greek is very interesting. It really means ordinariness. I talked about this, ordinariness. When Jesus says, "Come to me, I am meek and humble of heart," he uses that same word. It means ordinary. If you could get in a time machine and go to Nazareth, you wouldn't be able to pick out Jesus and Mary out of a crowd of two. They were so ordinary. In our world, we exalt the great presidents and prime ministers and important people and movie actors. But the gospel of Christ exalts the ordinary. It's the ordinary which is important to God. We think that, well, no, you got to be powerful, you got to be famous, you got to be rich. God's eye is on the sparrow, not the eagle. Ordinariness. God loves the ordinary, like you and like me. And when I realize how ordinary I am, then the marvel of God's love is even richer. So, who was Peter? He was nobody. He was ordinary. He worked as a fisherman for a living. I don't think you can get much more ordinary than that. I love the scene in the Bible where Jesus is walking along the shore after his public ministry's begun, and there's so many people crowding around him because it was rumored that he could heal the sick, that he asked Peter if he could get into his boat and shove off a few feet so he could speak to the crowd. Peter did, and he wanted to reward Peter. So what he did was he said, "Cast out." And of course, Peter was a professional. And he said to Jesus, "Well, Rabbi, if you want me to, I've been fishing all night." Not that that means anything. He pushed out. He caught so many fish that the boat began to sink. And I love the scene. He falls on his knees in the boat. That boat was full of flopping fish. Peter must have been waist deep in fish. It's a pretty funny scene. He was just an ordinary guy. He ran off a few times, chickened out. He'd always say, "I'm going to be there for you." And then he'd say, "Who, me?" Well, you know the story.